Oh yeah, this has a perfect view of my crotch. Hey everybody, we're just now getting started, so I'm just going to wait a few minutes for more people to join. Thank you so much for coming to the premiere Chapter 1 reading of my new book, TWINK, written by the beautiful Taylor Saracen. So just, we'll wait a minute or two here so we can get a little bit populated, and we're going to get started on Chapter 1. Hey everybody, I see Francis is here with us. A lot of familiar faces. Hey Nathan. Thank you guys so much for joining. How's the view down there? This is perfect, right? Instagram safe, and then we'll tell a story. Good to see everybody. Hey, Elliot Curtis, thank you for coming. All smiles, thanks so much. And I also have a nice glass of scotch here to enjoy this with. Hi there from Toronto. The Jinx says, "Nice goatee, Daddy." Thank you. I shaved last night. I just have been feeling, I've been working out so much, it grows instantly, so. All right, I think we're looking pretty good. I'm about to get started. Nathan Vegas says, "What are you drinking?" It's some Dalmore scotch. This is why my facial hair is growing. I drink the scotch and then it just, I don't know, I shaved this morning, like what the hell? There's also a lot of hair on my chest and balls now because of drinking it. Price Garth says, "You're hot, Daddy." Thank you. Thank you. Hi from Cuba in the U.S. Navy. Hi there. Hey, Jojo. Good to see you. Okay, guys, it's 7:02, and we hit 100 viewers, so I'm going to go ahead and start. And this is my new book, TWINK, if you haven't heard about it yet. It's just a kind of a biography, a little bit fictionalized about my life in high school and dealing with being a faggot. Written by Taylor Saracen, the lovely Taylor. All right, let's get this started. Okay, we're starting Chapter 1. There was only so much a body could endure, and Kyle's had taken enough. Every time his thin frame was pushed against a row of lockers by relentless rednecks, he felt it for days. Black and blue welts blossomed on Texas tanned skin, a reminder of what an outcast he was in the backwoods of Tennessee. They didn't want to understand him, and he didn't expect them to try. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut and braced for impact, never growing used to the pain, only learning to handle it. He'd dealt with worse. So had his car. It reverberated in his bones when the licorice black paint of his Corvette was keyed by jealous jocks who didn't think a twink like him deserved such a masculine muscle car. They were probably expected him to have a flaccid Ford Focus or something equally as impotent. It was unsettling to the Hicks that he had more than them. He had things they coveted. Instinctively, Kyle held his breath as a sweaty ham-hock hand clenched the nape of his neck and slammed his head into the door of the girls' bathroom. "This is where you piss from now on," the meathead growled, shoving Kyle into the lavatory. The cool tile floor chilled his beet-red cheeks as he lay on the ground, holding his knees close to his chest, hoping to avoid another hit. "Faggot!" The sound of the lock catching sent a rush of relief through Kyle's battered body. It was over. At least for the day. "What the fuck?" a girl shrieked, falling to her knees next to Kyle. "Are you okay?" He cringed when she touched his shoulder, exhausted by uninvited contact. "Sorry," she muttered. "You're bleeding." Kyle bristled and pulled himself to his feet. He wasn't a pussy. He didn't need to be cared for by some random cheerleader looking to do a good deed. "I'm fine." Stumbling towards the sink, he steadied himself and turned on the faucet. A quick glance in the mirror confirmed that he was bleeding. Perhaps it wasn't as bad as it looked since noses bled a lot, broken or not. Shit, he hoped it wasn't broken. He was too pretty to risk a fucked up mud. Handful after handful of warm water washed away the evidence of the idiot's hatred as Kyle focused on his own. Faggot. That piece of shit called him a faggot. Not only was the word reprehensible, but the implication that he was gay was irritating. "Why are you in the ladies' room, creep?" a girl from Kyle's physics class asked as she exited a stall. The scowl on her face was as nasty as the tone of her voice. "What's the difference?" he retorted, sweeping his blonde locks off his forehead and glaring back at her. "I had to take a shit, and these toilets are way cleaner." "You're disgusting," she scoffed, gaping at Kyle like he had 4 heads. Deciding it wasn't worth engaging any further, Kyle dried his hands with a wad of paper towels, purposely cutting in front of her as he made his way to the trash can. She was worth irritating, and he was eager to push her buttons. He'd been pushed enough. There was no reason not to push back. "Rude," she huffed as Kyle crossed between her and the sink one more time. She didn't know about anything rude. In the grand scheme of her life, Kyle was a gnat, an insignificant moment in time where she got more aggravated than she was at her boring baseline. True rudeness left an impact, and he was sure he would never register on her radar again. She'd bitch about Kyle's behavior to her friends over lunch, and he'd be forgotten by 5th period. How lucky she was to have the time and ability to worry about shit that didn't matter, while he was forced to focus on an endless succession of rude behavior that most certainly had changed the trajectory of his life. His mother's rampant selfishness had uprooted their lives, and she hadn't flinched. She put herself and her needs first, without so much a thought of how it would affect her kids. That was rude. Steeling himself for the next round of harassment, Kyle crossed his arms over his narrow chest before walking out of the bathroom and into the war zone. As expected, the bully who had been fucking with him moments before was directly across the bathroom door, posted up against the lockers. "You thought you could get away?" the bully snarled, cracking his knuckles as he walked towards Kyle. Though Kyle wasn't sure how his panicked brain gave him the signal, his feet began to pick up speed, running away from the asshole who was accelerating to catch him. The sound of sneakers squeaking against the tile floor filled the air, along with gasps and chuckles from the peers Kyle was shoving out of his way as he tried to escape the abuse. Stumbling over a girl who was squatting to tie her shoe, Kyle's back hit the ground. Attempting to crab walk away from the encroaching bully, Kyle went wide-eyed as the bigger boy leaned to lift his trembling body off by the armpits. As his body was thrown against yet another row of lockers, Kyle stopped and tried to get away. He was worn out from the initial breathing and the chase and didn't have the wherewithal to fight anymore. As if things couldn't get any worse, Kyle's crush and Iris Valley High School's insanely handsome quarterback, Luke Larson, was rushing towards him with fury flaming in his green eyes. Ooh, this is getting interesting. It was bad enough to be bullied, but having a guy he drooled over join in was a new level of disheartening. To Kyle's surprise, Luke grabbed the bully by the nape of his neck, slammed him down to the ground. Relief washed over Kyle, making his tired body more wobbly than it had been moments before. "Holy shit," Kyle muttered, glancing around at the group of students who had gathered around the scene. They'd probably think Luke was gay for standing up for him, and the boy-on-boy blemish on his reputation would get him run off the football team. Maybe then Luke would hate Kyle too. "You don't touch him again," Luke seethed through gritted teeth. "Do you understand me?" The bully quickly nodded his affirmation as a growing crowd watched the altercation with their jaws resting on the scuffed floor. Kyle had never spoken to Luke, save an occasional "hey" when they passed each other in the hallway between 6th and 7th period. The football player had acknowledged Kyle maybe 10 times, and Kyle had jacked off to the attention approximately 10,000 times. It was unfathomable that a guy like Luke was standing up for him in such a chivalrous way, and yet he was. After a couple more warnings, the quarterback let go of the bully and watched him as he scurried down the hallway. Once he was out of sight, Luke turned to regard Kyle. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving closer to Kyle, who was frozen in place. "I am fine," Kyle replied. shoving his hands in the pockets of his skinny jeans. Luke was so tall, handsome, and built, and it was intimidating for Kyle in the best way possible. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," Luke said softly, resting his hand tenderly on Kyle's cheek. The touch made it difficult for Kyle to breathe. It was too much and not enough at the same time. "I'm used to it," Kyle stated, chiding himself after the words escaped. He wasn't a victim. He didn't want Luke to think that was how he saw himself. "It's whatever." "It's unacceptable," Luke corrected, leaning down to lay a passionate kiss on his lips. It didn't feel real. Luke Larson was standing in the middle of IVHS's hallway making out with him. Somewhere in the back of his head, Kyle feared the affection was part of a greater humiliation scheme, one that would hurt worse than the physical pounding he's taken from the Bushland bully. Despite his worries, the kiss was anything but just disingenuous, pulsing with the passion of months of unrequited want. "I'll be okay," Kyle promised, but the warble in his voice and wobbling of his knees indicated he was anything but. It was all too much, and suddenly he was exhausted by the goings-on. Somehow, Luke understood his need for care and scooped him up by his gym-toned arms. The jaws that had already been on the floor were tugged down to the school's foundation and into the earth below, burying, besides Kyle's worries, Kyle had finally been able to bury there, unnecessary concerns now that he found someone to protect him. Tucking his face into the curve of Luke's neck, Kyle inhaled his savior's scent, letting the faint smell of sweat permeate his nostrils, and suddenly he was wet. Strains of saliva trickled from his mouth as his jeans struggled to contain the leaking hard-on pressed against them. "Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross!" a voice demanded, pummeling the perfect moment. Kyle lifted his head and glanced around, startled by the sight of his peers sitting in their desks, rather frozen in awe of Luke's display of heroism. "What have I told you about sleeping in class?" his physics teacher, Mr. Meyer, asked, hands on his hips wide. "Not to do it," Kyle offered, wiping his sleep-slobby mouth with the back of his hand. He'd completely passed out. "Don't sass me," Mr. Meyer warned. Fake out. "You asked me a question and I answered," Kyle sighed. "How is that sass?" The older man regarded him for a beat. "I asked you a question. According to the principles of centrifugal force, if I swing this weight around over my head and let it go, which direction will it fly?" "A straight line tangent from the origin," Kyle answered easily. "I guess you were paying attention," Mr. Meyer relented. Kyle nodded, though he knew damn well it was dumb luck. He happened to have glanced over the passage before class, the only portion of last night's assignment reading he'd actually looked at. As the pride in his scholastic smackdown subsided, the realization that Luke's devotion was a figment of his imagination hit Kyle harder than the imaginary bully had. As much as the beginning of this mind's movie had sucked, the ending had made it totally worthwhile. As he adjusted the boner that was very much rooted in reality, Kyle considered the implications of his football player fantasy. It was hot to have a man take a stand for him, care for him, and covet him. He wanted to be wanted like that. His new life in Tennessee was totally shitty, but the idea of having some testosterone-jacked hottie save him from it all was sexy as hell. He'd been the damsel in distress if it meant he would be wooed by a guy like Luke Larson. Raking his fingers through his hair, Kyle struggled to focus, finding it impossible to stop swooning over the daydream. He didn't want to let it go, but he intermittently forced himself to focus on the chicken scratch Mr. Meyer was scrawling on the board. The only thing more depressing than the fact his fantasy wasn't real was that he still had another 13 minutes left in physics class. If he was going to be teased by a dream, he would have preferred it carried through until the end of the period. His premature rousing for nothing more than an endless succession of word problems was just cruel. Kyle deserved a brain break, so he clocked out the thoughts of Luke's arms and how good it felt to have someone give a shit enough to take care of him, even if only in fantasy. Well, that's it, everybody. Chapter 1 of TWINK. Thanks for joining me, and I will be back same time on Thursday, and we'll read Chapter 2. Bye.